They said the breweries of Sumer were places where the air itself grew heavy with grain. Barley soaked in shallow pits, darkened on reed mats, and sprouted in quiet rows that covered the floor like a living carpet. When brewers stepped across the room, the wet husks clung to their ankles. The scent was unmistakable, warm, damp, and slightly sour, the smell of malt beginning its slow work. These were the first cities on earth: Ur, Uruk, Lagash, places where writing was still young, but where beer was already old. Inside their breweries, work began long before dawn. Men ground barley into coarse flour. They baked bapir, a hard, dark bread meant not for eating but for brewing, stacking the loaves in tall rows that cooled into silence. Nothing about these rooms was grand. The walls were simple mud brick. The tools were wooden paddles, clay jars, woven mats. But every surface carried the marks of use: scratches from stirring sticks, stains from the wort that overflowed, dents where jars had knocked against stone. When the mash rested, it thickened into something closer to porridge than drink, cloudy, grainy, heavy, a liquid that settled into layers, foam on top, sediment below, and the beer somewhere in the middle. No one drank it from the rim of a jar. They lowered long reed straws into the vessel, reaching past the floating grain to the liquid beneath. Long before empires rose, before tablets carried myths and kings claimed descent from gods, the people of Sumer gathered around this murky beer, a drink that no brewer fully clarified, yet every household understood. It was the taste of the first cities learning what it meant to feed themselves. Sumer did not rise on stone or metal. It rose on grain. By 3000 BCE, the cities along the lower Mesopotamian plain lived in a rhythm shaped by barley fields and irrigation canals. Farmers flooded their plots by moon cycles. Millers ground the harvest into coarse flour, and brewers, often women in the earliest households, turned the grain into a drink older than recorded history. In those days, beer was not leisure. It was nourishment, wage, and offering. Clay tablets from Uruk do not tell myths, they tell accounting. 13 measures of barley to the brewer, 40 to the workers, 12 to the singers. Beer flowed through the economy as surely as water through the canals. Workers were paid in it. Priests poured it into temple jars. Families drank it with bread as the sun fell behind the mud-brick rooftops. And the brewers, the quiet laborers who kept the vats warm and the grain alive, worked by rules no one wrote down. They soaked barley until it sprouted. They crushed the malt with stones. They dried bapir loaves until they hardened into blocks that could survive weeks of heat. They lifted jars as tall as a grown man, each one filled with mash that thickened as it cooled. Nothing about their craft was precise. The ingredients changed with the season. The temperature changed with the wind. The yeast came from the air itself. What stayed the same was the drink, cloudy, earthy, and alive, a beer that required patience to brew and a straw to drink. In the first cities humans ever built, this was the taste of daily life. Among the brewer's tools, nothing puzzled later generations more than bapir. It looked like bread, but it was never meant to be eaten. Shaped in thick loaves, baked until nearly rock, bapir was closer to a preserved ingredient than food, a way to lock the sweetness of grain into a form that could wait weeks before being used. Texts describe it with care: barley flour, malt, aromatics, sometimes honey, mixed, shaped, dried. Not browned for flavor, but hardened for survival. Modern scholars call it twice-baked bread, but the brewers of Sumer understood it more simply. It was the spine of the beer. When Bapier was broken into chunks and soaked again, the dried sugars dissolved back into the mash. What had once been solid became part of the liquid, carrying the yeast, the sweetness, and the memory of the fields where the grain first grew. A fragment of a tablet mentions 18 liters of Bapier for 45 liters of golden beer. The numbers were precise, though the process was not. Some loaves were drier than others, some carried wild yeast, others carried none. Some absorbed the wort quickly, others required hours. Yet the brewers trusted it. Bapier did not spoil in the heat, did not mold in the damp, did not twist in the sun. It waited, patient, silent, until the day it was broken apart and returned to life. And in that return, something remarkable happened. A bread that could last months created a beer that lasted only days. A drink born from permanence, destined to fade almost as soon as it was ready. Centuries later, scribes pressed a hymn into clay, a long rhythmic praise to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. Scholars would come to call it the oldest recipe in the world. But anyone expecting instructions found instead a puzzle. Words missing, lines broken, meanings uncertain. The hymn spoke of Bapier mixed with sweet aromatics, of malt watered on the ground, of mash spread on reed mats, of a vat that makes a pleasant sound. Beautiful phrases, but not measurements, not temperatures, not times. It was less a recipe and more a memory of one, something meant to be sung by people who already knew the work by heart, a ritual, not a guide. And that is where the confusion began. A line describes the fermenting vat roaring like the Tigris and Euphrates. Another mentions honey and wine adding flavor. Another compares the final pour to an onrush of rivers. To modern readers, it is poetry. To Sumerian brewers, it was simply familiar noise, the language of a craft passed from hand to hand, not page to page. Archaeologists studying the hymn admit the truth plainly. No one can fully decode the process it describes, not because the brewers were careless, but because their world did not explain itself. Knowledge lived in practice, not in instruction. So the hymn remains what it always was, a fragment of praise, a tribute to a craft already ancient when the words were written. The first civilizations built their daily lives on skills so common, so universal, that no one thought to write them carefully. And in losing the details, we gained a mystery. Sumerian beer did not belong to one class or one moment. It belonged to everyone. In temples, priests poured beer into ritual vessels as offerings. Gods were said to drink it through reed straws, much like mortals did. Myths speak of feasts where the deities themselves became light-headed, their judgments softened by sweet beer. In palaces, guests drank stronger, richer brews, some flavored with dates, others with herbs that added fragrance or color. And in the streets, ordinary people drank beer that was simpler, thick, filling, often barely fermented, a liquid meal. Clay tablets reveal a truth the modern world rarely imagines. Workers received part of their wages in beer. It fueled laborers digging canals. It fed women grinding grain. It sustained builders laying brick in the heat, row by row. And because it was safer than river water, families drank it with meals, children included. The variety was enormous. Golden beer, dark beer, red beer, sweet beer, strained beer. For celebrations, beer for daily survival. Some had nearly 5% alcohol, others had almost none. But all shared something in common. They were cloudy. They settled into layers as they rested. And so, as in the title of this story, the people of Sumer drank their beer not by lifting the jar, but by lowering a straw past the floating grain and into the heart of the drink. To drink Sumerian beer was to taste the world as it was, unfiltered, uneven, and undeniably alive. Modern recreations of Sumerian beer all share the same confession. This is only a guess. Even with the hymn, the tablets, the residue on ancient jars, no modern brewer can replicate the method exactly. The reasons lie in details the ancients never bothered to explain. Their yeast, for instance, did not come from a packet. It lived in the air, on the grain, on the tools. A brewer working near a canal would produce a beer different from one brewing near a temple courtyard. Their water varied with the city. Had mineral-rich wells. Uruk drew from canals that changed with the season. Their barley was not the barley we know. It was an older, tougher strain, one that sprouted differently, tasted different, fermented at its own pace. Even their tools shaped the drink. Clay jars absorbed flavors over time. Reed mats carried traces of old batches. Ropes, paddles, baskets all carried wild yeasts from the air into the mash. And so the beer changed with every household, every jar. Archaeologists testing residue find markers of date syrup in one city, herbs in another, and traces of fermentation that do not match any modern strain. Nothing was standardized. Everything was alive. This is why modern attempts taste wildly different. Some sour, some sweet, some nutty, some oddly mild. The brewers of Sumer never aimed for consistency. Their world did not demand it. Beer was not a product, it was a process. One shaped by heat, by humidity, by hours of sun, by a stray gust of wind carrying yeast across a courtyard. A drink only they could make, because their world was the ingredient. What did Sumerian beer look like? Not like anything on a modern shelf. Descriptions, residues, and artistic depictions all point to the same truth. It was thick enough to chew. Contemporary drawings show large jars on the ground, circles of people leaning forward, each holding a reed straw. The straws were long, to reach past the floating grain, narrow to avoid the sediment settled below. The beer itself was not clear. It carried fragments of malt, flakes of bar-pear, bits of husk and foam that clung to the sides of the jar. Some versions were pale, cloudy gold, others darker, almost reddish from date syrup or roasted grain. Temperature varied. Some were drunk warm from the fermenting vat, others cooled a little as the clay absorbed heat. Taste, too, was unpredictable. Writers described it as sweet, faintly sour, nutty, or pleasantly thick. Strength varied not by intent, but by chance. If yeast thrived, the beer was strong. If it faltered, the beer was soft. But no matter the variation, the ritual was the same. People gathered around the jar, lowered their straws, and drank together. This was not a solitary drink. It was a communal act. A circle formed around a single vessel, the city's life pressed into liquid form. In a world without glass cups, without metal kettles, without standardized anything, This was how beer lived, and it endured not because it was refined, but because it was familiar. A cloudy drink shared by hands that built the first cities, cooked the first meals, and shaped the earliest days of civilization. In Sumer, beer was more than nourishment. It was memory. Families brewed it the way their parents had. Temples stored it beside offerings of grain. Workers drank it after long days in heat that cracked the soil. Scribes recorded it on tablets before they recorded myths. Beer travelled with soldiers, merchants, midwives, canal diggers. It marked festivals, contracts, births, and burials. It connected households to the land, from the barley fields that fed them, to the rivers that watered the fields, to the brewers who turned grain into something that restored the body after work. No lines separate Sumerian beer from Sumerian life. The two were woven together. And though the taste has vanished, the traces remain. In the hymn that praises Ninkasi, in the clay tablets filled with ration lists, in the pottery stained with microscopic grains, in the echoes of a civilization that built the world's first cities, laws, and stories. For them, beer was not a beverage, it was a foundation, something that made the weight of daily life a little lighter, a cloudy drink held in a single jar, gathered by a circle of hands. Today, nothing made in Sumer survives intact. The palaces are dust. The canals have dried. The fields where barley once grew are quiet. But the idea of beer, that small, stubborn invention shaped by hands 5,000 years ago, remains. Every brewery, every pint, every ritual of sharing a drink with others carries a faint shadow of those early rooms where brewers stirred mash with wooden paddles and trusted yeast they could not see. Their beer would confuse us now. It was thick, unfiltered, unstable. It lasted only days. It was made from bread. It was drunk through straws so the grain wouldn't rise into the mouth. And yet, in that simplicity, they found something lasting. Not a recipe, that part is lost. Not a taste that changed with every jar, but a way of gathering, a way of sharing the work of the land, a way of ending the day with something warm, flawed, and familiar. The world has forgotten their names. The hymn speaks of gods, not brewers. The tablets list rations, not the people who mixed them. But the drink they shaped, murky, earthy, alive, was the quiet heartbeat of the first cities ever built. And through it, across thousands of years, their story still rises.